So I would stay home until I got married. No college, no dating, no jobs. I was supposed to learn how to be a wife by learning how to submit to my father. So that's the core of what my experience was in this movement. It's far-reaching. It goes across many denominations. They don't always use the terms to make them recognizable, but other terms that might be helpful are the quiverful movement, or if you're familiar with the documentary Shiny Happy People about Bill Gothard, that's all connected.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram, is not here today, as you could see if you're watching on YouTube. But I'm just telling you, the listener, who may just be listening to us through your ear holes, Josh is not here. So instead, we actually have with us a phenomenal person joining us, Cait West. She's a writer and editor based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her work's been published in The Revealer, Religion Dispatch, Fourth Genre, and Hawaii Pacific Review, among others. She's an advocate and a survivor of the Christian Patriarchy Movement, serves on the editorial board for Tears of Eden, a nonprofit providing resources for survivors of spiritual abuse, and co-hosts the podcast Survivors Discuss. And today, Cait's here to talk about her breaking away from the Christian patriarchy in her new book called Rift. So welcome to the show, Cait.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah. So, okay, Rift. So give me some backstory. What's the title alluding to, or did you pick that title? Maybe that's probably the better question.
Yes, it's always been the title of this project because it started out just as a collection of essays, and now it's this book, and I'll hold it up for people on YouTube.
YouTube.
A rift is a geological term about two pieces of earth that split apart, right? And for me, it was an apt metaphor for how it felt to leave my family and this patriarchal movement and to be on the other side. And it also helped me understand it's not a binary because there's a before and an after, but sometimes I still feel like I'm living in the past. And so I use that geological metaphor to say that if you dig down deep enough, the materials are all the same. We just evolved differently after the split. So that's where that word came from, because I do write about a geology in the book, but mostly it's my story of leaving this movement behind.
That's awesome. So, since we started recording, I think we've mentioned, or I've mentioned, the word Christian patriarchy probably a couple of times. So, what is Christian patriarchy?
Yeah, it's a movement. Sometimes it goes by biblical patriarchy. It's based on this ideology that God is the ultimate patriarch, and that's why God created man first in Adam and women second to be the helpers to men, so that there is this hierarchy in how society should be run, with men at the top and women submitting and helping them. And so being a girl in this movement, I was always told I would be a stay-at-home daughter after I turned 18. So I would stay home until I got married. No college, no dating, no jobs. I was supposed to learn how to be a wife by learning how to submit to my father. So that's the core of what my experience was in this movement. It's far-reaching. It goes across many denominations. They don't always use the terms to make them recognizable, but other terms that might be helpful are the quiverful movement, or if you're familiar with the documentary Shiny Happy People about Bill Gothard, that's all connected.
Wow. I heard somebody once say that, Eve came from the bone of Adam, a rib or something like that. And, but every other man after that came from a woman.
That's true.
It's like just that one event, and then all of a sudden it's like women are below men, but it's like, but every other man after that came from a woman,
right,
so
yeah.
it's bizarre. I mean, so let's unpack sort of patriarchy just a little bit more kind of in the Christian context. Mm-hmm. So I didn't grow up in the church. So there, even to this day, there's a lot of terms that I just am not familiar with, or concepts. My wife, kind of in contrast, was raised in a church. She's a PK. So she's sort of like my, I don't know, my Christian dictionary when I'm like, what does fundamentalist mean? But like patriarchy, like, is it mainly just grooming a woman to become subservient to man, or are there also like other limitations that go along with it? Like, not, I don't know, wearing dresses past your knees or something like that.
Yeah, it's all encompassing. So, I mean, the term patriarchy is not just specific to this movement. We see patriarchy in our broader culture. But when I'm talking about it, it's this specific ideology and how it plays out in churches. And so it encompasses your entire life. So even if you're raised as a boy, you're stuck in this rigid gender box. So there's always really strict gender roles, and you can't move outside of those. And so there's not a lot of room for being an individual in this movement. And it's very like hyper masculine and hyper feminine. And the interesting part about it is that because the patriarch of the family is the father, they're kind of like a miniature cult leader of that family. And so every family might have variations on these rules about how long your dresses are, or whether you can wear pants at home, things like that. So what people brings people together is these beliefs. And then sometimes what it looks like, it might be a little bit different. So for instance, I had friends who had to wear head coverings in church, but my father didn't believe in that. So we didn't have to do that, for instance.
I mean, like where do people kind of get these ideas, to oppress women in this regard? I mean, like you just said something that I thought was kind of fascinating, that some people wore head coverings, but your father did not. And like, in my mind, I'm just thinking like that's like two different kinds of theology or hermeneutics. I'm not really quite sure what the right word is, but yeah, I mean, like where are people kind of grounding these beliefs in?
That's a complicated answer, because if you asked them, and including me, when I was part of it, we would say the Bible, right? Like we base our beliefs on the Bible. What a lot of Christians say that, right? Or most evangelicals say that. But I think I've come to understand that the interpretation of the Bible has differed a lot over the years. And I think you mentioned you had Beth Allison Barr on the show, and she's done the research to show the history of patriarchy in the church. And so we can see that over time, this broader cultural hierarchy has been part of the church as well. In my case, with this specific movement, there were very specific leaders putting out a lot of material to teach these things. People like Doug Wilson, who is a pastor in Moscow, Idaho. He's still a pastor. Doug Phillips, who ran Vision Forum, which is now no longer existent. My pastor, Kevin Swanson, who's still a pastor. These were leaders in that movement to teach these things about gender and that men needed to be in charge. I see it as this reaction to feminism. I think in the 80s and 90s, with the religious right gaining more power, I feel like it's all kind of connected. And so I would point to the historians like Kristen Dumais, who can walk us through how these things are all connected. But in my experience, it was very much a reactionary movement to feminism.
Oh, interesting. I think, that I suppose I can see that. And, kind of on the point of Doug Wilson, it's funny. We had Stephen Wolfe on our show. He wrote the book Case for Christian Nationalism. And if you haven't read it, I mean, it's sort of littered with, kind of the Bible says women have to do this, non-believers are going to be that, and it's like, it's really out there, and it's nothing I really particularly believe, although he was a really good guest and very, very cordial. But in regards to your book, so like, why did you write this book? Why is sort of like now the time that you felt the world, needed to hear your story?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I started writing this book years ago. I left my family about 11 years ago, and then I went to college to study writing, and I started writing this for my creative thesis. So it was just a matter of me trying to express myself and create something out of what I felt like was very confusing and hard to recover from, because I struggled with PTSD and all these traumatic symptoms. And so writing helped me piece it back together. And then once I started sharing publicly online, I realized a lot more people have experienced spiritual abuse and patriarchal abuse. And so I wanted to keep talking about it because it felt like nobody was doing that at the time. And, I think now it's becoming more relevant with how our political movements are working right now with more authoritarianism and, patriarchal and Christian nationalist beliefs. And so I want to be a voice because so often women like me were silenced, and so many women are continually silenced. And I think we need to hear more of these stories of this other side of what it's really like when these beliefs impact you as a woman or anyone who's not, a man in power, basically. So, yeah, I think it's important that we hear this side of the story.
Yeah, when you say that you left your family, can you talk about that?
Yeah. So because I was a stay-at-home daughter, I didn't have, access really to the outside world. I didn't know that I had legal rights to leave, and I didn't get out till I was 25. And so leaving for me was a serious break with my family, with the movement, because I decided to make my own decisions. And so leaving and moving away from my family really was like an escape or like a big rift in my own family. So, but I was in my mid-20s feeling like I was a teenager trying to, start my life over.
Wow. Like, so I guess what's the relationship with your family now?
Yeah. It's been a long journey because I have 3 siblings, and this whole belief system has impacted us a lot in a very negative ways and very specific to our personal identities. So it's taken years, but we've all been able to get out and build relationships with each other again after trying to figure out who we are. And so all of my siblings are really supportive of me telling this story. And so I'm really grateful for that. And my mother is supportive. When I first started talking about this in like 2019, I think, that's when my father got upset with what I was saying and stopped communicating with me. So that's the last time I really, truly talked to him. In a sense that, there's grief with that, and there's a loss of that relationship. And also I feel free to tell my truth now without worrying about it.
That sounds horrible. And yeah, I mean, like what I'm having a hard time understanding is like, so your experience was terrible, but I'm imagining there's probably still other women that are, exposed to this same kind of, oppression. Like why do you think that they haven't left, told their story, or, just sort of escaped this very like controlling type of environment?
It's extremely difficult to leave. It's just like any other, it's not just like, but it's very similar to other domestic abuse situations. And I think the statistics for an intimate partner violence is it takes at least 7 times of attempting to leave to get out of those situations. So it's the same kind of dynamics where there's power and control. And I have talked to stay-at-home daughters to this day. There are still women living like this who don't know how to leave. There's these different aspects to it. Like there's the mental part where you feel like you have to stay because you've been told this is how you honor God. And so if you're breaking the rules, you're disobeying God. That's a lot of weight to put on somebody. And then you're also told you don't have the right to make decisions. And so that kind of emotional abuse really does a number on your head, and it makes it difficult to make decisions and to even imagine what a different life would be like. Then the other side of that is the practical means. It's extremely difficult to save money when you aren't allowed to have a job or go to college or talk to people outside of your community. It's extremely difficult. And especially if you're not married. I think for me, getting married was one of the instigations for me leaving. Getting married to somebody who wasn't approved by my father. But that happens often. But if you're single, it's even harder to leave because you don't have that extra support financially and trying to figure it out. So, it's extremely difficult.
And you used a term that I've never heard before until I read your book and heard you say it, but the stay-at-home daughter movement. Like, can you sort of like unpack that? Give us like a day or a week in the life of a stay-at-home daughter, and like, what are some of the things that other girls, would or may be able to do that you were prohibited from doing growing up?
A lot of things. So, my day-to-day life was very boring, actually, because I didn't have my younger brother's only 3 years younger than me, so there wasn't a lot for me to do. A lot of stay-at-home daughters are, additional parents to their younger children. So they're homeschooling them, they're taking care of them, they're cooking for them. That happens a lot because in the quiverful stay-at-home daughter world, you don't usually use birth control. So there's a lot of children. That was not the case for me. So my father, because I, technically like belonged to him, he would send me out to other families who needed help. So I would go and help other homeschool families with their children, or help homeschool or cook or babysit for other families if my dad wanted me to. And I think I made like $3 an hour, for instance, which I was allowed to keep the money. So, I mean, that's a low bar, but that meant a lot. And so I was doing stuff like that. I was volunteering for church. I was helping my mother around the house. I was doing things for my father. I was kind of always needing to be available for my parents, even into my 20s. So it didn't allow me to have a lot of freedom to explore what it would be like to live among people my age, or who I really was as a person.
So, I'm just curious, like, you didn't grow up in a town called Gideon by any chance, did you? I'm just checking.
Nope.
No? Okay. All right. And for those that don't know what Gideon is, look it up. Hashtag Handmaid's Tale. I think it should be required watching for like all men in the United States, because most of the women I've spoken to have watched it, except Beth Barr, actually.
It's a hard thing to watch, but it's interesting because the author of the book has said that she based a lot of those stories on real things that have happened. So this is not anything that is far off in the future. It's already happened and is happening to women.
Yeah, it seems like it's time for a sequel or something like that. So I actually reached out to Margaret Atwood to see if I can get her on the show. But it was going to cost.
Invite me back.
It was going to cost me $10,000, and I'm like, that's okay. I mean, I'll just read her books and watch her Hulu television show. But I'm curious, like, what role do you think politics kind of played into maybe both your sort of experience under the Christian patriarchy and then maybe just the larger and broader movement.
Yeah. So, I grew up in a family where like everything was very entwined. So like there's homeschooling, there's the patriarchy stuff. There's also the Christian nationalist stuff, which wasn't a term we would have used. We might have used the term dominionism, which is related, and this idea that Christians should make the government into a Christian government.
And 7 Mountain Mandate, all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So for instance, R.J. Rushdoony, who was one of the founding people who taught dominionism or Reconstructionism, I'm sorry. One year for history class, I just listened to his audio tapes. So that was like the kind of education I was receiving, knowing that my generation was supposed to grow up and make the country into this glorified version of our family, right? Where gender roles are really cut and dry, and Christians have control and power in the government. So that's like the childhood I was growing up in. And now that I've left and understanding how the way I was raised was so authoritarian and harmful, and now I'm seeing these same kinds of authoritarian leaders getting into our government, that's really difficult for me to process, because when I left, I thought I was like really leaving. And so it feels like all of this has followed me into the world. But I feel really have complicated feelings about it, because I don't want to cause more like fear mongering or apocalyptic, like it's the end of the world if these people take over. I do feel concerned about certain leaders in the government and certain Christians who want to get power, because in my opinion, that goes against what Jesus was saying about who should be in power. So anyways, I definitely want to keep telling my story because of what's happening with women's rights right now in the U.S. And it's a hard reality to live in my body and know that things like bodily autonomy is something I could lose again. After living so long, feeling like I was property.
Yeah, and your book explores these themes of like control, manipulation, a lot of which you've already mentioned here. But like, what was sort of the trigger where you came to recognize like this is wrong? like this is not okay. And like, how did you sort of like handle those emotions, like that awakening, if you will?
Yeah, it was a slow process. Because abuse and control can really sap your sense of self and like make you feel like you're not alive. I struggled with that as a child, but I remember times when I had thoughts to myself of like, oh, maybe I don't agree with that, or maybe I wish I could go to public school, things that I couldn't voice out loud. But I repressed all of those feelings, all those desires to go to college and to study. I wanted to study music, and I just never told anyone. And then in my early 20s, I had a courtship. So part of this whole patriarchal movement is that you don't go on dates. You do a courtship with your father as the mediator, and he helps you find a husband.
Hey. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you about that, but okay. Keep going.
So I had this courtship with this person, and it was very long, and I thought I was going to get married to him, and then my father broke it off, and I felt so helpless, like I had no say in what was happening to me, and I was so heartbroken because I thought I was losing someone I was going to get married to, and my father turned to me and said, "You need to repent of your emotions. You're cheating on your future spouse." And And I just like this little voice inside of me just got really loud all of a sudden and was like, that is a lie. That is not true. Like, I cannot apologize for loving someone. And that was, I was 21 and I didn't leave till I was 25. So it took me some time to leave after that. But that's one of the biggest moments I can look back on and say, that's when I started to change my mind.
Oh my gosh. Geez. I'm just side note, editor's note. I'm really glad I came to the faith well before I started this podcast, because like I've heard some crazy stories from people that, like I would find it very difficult to come to my faith in at least the environment we're in, like in this generation. So, but yeah, the courtship. This is the first I've ever heard of this happening within like Christian families. And I mean, then again, like Pastor Josh, my co-host, he's probably heard of it. He's probably been a part of it. I don't know, but yeah, how does that work? Like is that like an arranged marriage or something?
Not quite. They wouldn't use that word. So it's kind of related to, it's definitely related to purity culture. So this idea that you need to stay sexually pure until you get married. So people who are familiar with I Kiss Dating Goodbye, it's kind of along those lines, except it takes it a step further, where you have to be physically pure, but also emotionally pure, where you don't have feelings for someone unless you're committed to getting married to them. And so the courtship process is different from dating because you never are alone with the other person. You always have a chaperone. You're not allowed to talk about certain topics if that might make you emotional or feel affection. And your father is in charge of the whole process. So every father might do this a little bit differently because, again, they're like the mini cult leaders. My father followed the Pathway to Christian Marriage, which is a little booklet, which is still available online. And it taught you how to, week by week, go through questions to figure out if you were eligible to get married to each other. And there were a lot of like doctrine and theological questions and like questions about homeschooling and anything that would fit within this world to make sure you were following the rules as you got married. But then your father could say no at any time for any reason, right? Because he's God's representative in your family. So he has the ultimate control. Once you went through the courtship process, you then would become betrothed, which is just another word for being engaged. And they thought it was more serious because you would actually sign like a covenant that promised that you were going to get married.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that was when the man would ask your father if he could marry you. And then your father could say yes or no. And if your father said yes, then the man could propose. It was never like a surprise. And then you could say yes. But what I need to like clarify always is there's this not like, it's coercive control. It's not like you have a lot of choices. Or I guess I should use the term bounded choice, because you don't have the option really to say no most of the time, because this is your calling, right? To be a wife and a mother. What else are you going to do? And so if your father wants you to get married to someone, it's very influential on your decision making, right? So it's not a true option. It's not quite an arranged marriage, but it's almost there.
So at what point in time do you like exchange dowries? Or is that a part
like
of it?
The goat?
Yeah.
Well, that's actually written in the Pathway to Christian Marriage. So like the engagement ring had to be a certain value to represent.
What?
Yeah. It was very specific, but yeah.
Like, okay. So like, what was the value? Because like, I'm thinking about like my wife was raised in this, and you're helping me kind of piece together some of her early like religious upbringing. Because I mean, we just don't really talk about it. Like, and she spent the time as for a season, like as a Mennonite. I think her dad pastored at a Mennonite church or something like that. But she was very much sort of raised in kind of this purity culture kind of thing. So when I proposed to her, I mean, I kind of did the whole blocking and tackling. I called her dad. I mean, she lives in Indiana, and I was living in Washington at the time. So I called him, and, he kind of gave me the third degree, like, okay, tell me about your faith and blah, 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 blah. What do you do for a living? And I'm just like, man, this is like pretty intrusive, like, do I really need your permission? this is like what people do, right? Like, I've been married before. So yeah, I'm curious, like what does the value of the ring have to be, and what are some other things about like the wedding, like who pays for the wedding?
So I think there were suggestions in the Pathway to Christian Marriage. I can't remember exactly. It had something to do with salary and like how many months' salary was the ring, and then I think the young man was also supposed to get out a life insurance policy. So it was like, trying to translate these older ancient principles into something that would actually work in our modern world. And then after that, I mean, it was really up to the father to decide how everything went. And it's funny because you pick and choose traditions you want to do, right? So the father pays for the wedding, and then the groom's father pays for the rehearsal dinner. So it's kind of like still the tradition that I think a lot of people still follow. But there were elements in the ceremony like that were specific, like you had to have a white runner going down the aisle only when the bride walked down, to show her purity, right? So like the father's like saying, I kept her pure for you. Here she is. And really it's just like a transfer of property, this whole ceremony. So yeah, it was baked into like every little detail.
So, and I'm curious, like, so, my wife's white, I'm black for you, those that are listening and watching on YouTube. Like, would this sort of courtship ever like include, multi-ethnic, multiracial like pairings? Because I'm curious if this is like kind of just a sort of, thing of the white Christian church or something.
Yeah, I would say it's primarily a white church. And I think at least at that time, I don't think it's the same anymore, but the homeschooling world was very white. And so, and also the ideas of dominionism are very racist. And so in our church, it was mostly white. And so there weren't like a lot of options for who you could go have a relationship with. But that said, that wasn't like completely that way. And I think they wouldn't have said you couldn't get married to someone of a different ethnicity. But I do remember hearing things like it will be harder for you if you do this. So like that old school, like really racist white supremacist stuff was definitely there. And I didn't have a lot of interactions with people who weren't white just because of my isolation.
So I'm going to get back to an earlier comment you made about the title of the book. It seems like throughout the memoir, you kind of weave together reflections on geology, places your family lived with like a personal narrative. So like how does like the landscape and environment kind of shape your understanding of the things you've lived through?
Yeah, I wanted to explore where we come from and where our ideas come from and who we are and how much of that is our environment, And I think for me, having this manufactured environment, it wanted to make me into something, and how much choice do I have in changing and having free will? And so those are just like these big ideas I'm grappling with in the book. And the idea of place, I always felt like everywhere we lived it almost felt like a character in my story of these dramatic landscapes, because we started in Pennsylvania and there's these rolling green hills, and then we moved to Colorado in the mountains, and it's just like this contrast of like feet and feet of snow at a time, and really cold. And then we moved to Hawaii, which is like one season all year round. And so it's just like these really harsh contrasts, and was the background of my life. And I just always wanted to write about that. And I feel like it's part of who I am. I've never felt like I can go back to a place that I could call home. I've moved so often. And so that's just my personality. But also I just think about how our relationship with the land shapes us, and how we shape the land. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, because I'm deconstructing patriarchy, I felt like I also needed to do decolonization work, and thinking through my ancestry and what we've done to the people who were here before us. And because I have an ancestor who was on the Mayflower, for instance. And so for me, it's like going back through generational trauma and trying to break the cycle. And so I had to dig really deep, not to make a pun, but I felt like I had to go really deep into the past and understand how we've disconnected so much. You know, this idea of rift, I've broken from my family, but so much of the patriarchy movement, we've disconnected from ourselves and our bodies and the truth of history, and treating the land as something to be valued and taken care of. And so this is a lot of words, and I feel like I'm rambling, but that's why I'm trying to put it into a book, is because to me, it seems all connected.
Yeah, it really is. You know, it's so interesting that you said that. So we spoke with an author, Native American activist, Mark Charles, who wrote a book called Unsettling Truths. It's all about like the doctrine of discovery. And anyways, when we were speaking with him, he had talked about, he went to this conference, and you know, he was really kind of struggling with his faith, because he identifies as a Christian, but he also has like a strong connection to like his Native ancestry. And he was talking about how he's sort of in this process of seriously interrogating his faith, because, you know, he wants to make sure that he's not a Christian just because of like white settlers, you know, like,
right, yeah.
Like he's a Christian because he really believes in what Jesus did at the cross. So I just thought that what you said was just so apt and kind of spot on. But, you know, I want to ask you about your complicity in, you know, maybe growing up. And I'm going to share this other story of my wife, you know, where she has said that, you know, she may have made some comments to people in her sphere of circle of friends, like growing up, from a very sort of strong Christian kind of viewpoint. I was like, oh, you're gay, you know, you're going to hell, or whatnot. So like, did you experience, or looking back, like, do you feel that you were complicit in, you know, propagating, you know, the same thing that you've escaped?
100%. I think that's partly why it's so hard to write this story, is because to tell the whole truth, I have to tell the truth about, you know, my part in it. And I was extremely judgmental as a kid. I talk about, there's this line I believe in the book where I say, you know, developmentally children who are young, like age 5, that stage of development, you think in black and white. And so that's normal until you develop complex thinking. But I was taught that was how I should think forever. And so I was stuck in that black and white thinking of these are good people and those are bad people. And so I treated people that way. And I have a lot of regret. Friendships I've lost, people I was unkind to, things I have said. And I do want to own my complicity in that, and also understand the generational complicity, you know, of my heritage. what do I do with that information, right? Not just feel sorry about it, but what can I do now to be a better person and also to make up for all of that. And so that's kind of like how I think of the book, is like the beginning of that. I hope to keep doing that in the future.
Wow. Like, because of how central the theme is of like religious trauma, patriarchal religious trauma, like how do you kind of like approach the Bible, or if you are connected with the church now, like how are you sort of interacting and connecting, with sort of like a new group of believers, and what triggers are you sort of like sensitive to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, after I left my family, I still went to church for a long time, and I really wanted to be that voice of speaking against spiritual abuse. And I tried to do that for a long time. And then I found that the church I was in wasn't really welcoming that. And so I stopped going to church, and then I found my beliefs shifting a lot in that quiet space. And so I don't feel like organized religion is for me anymore. And so I don't really interact with the Bible in the terms of like a daily devotion type of thing. But I still feel very fascinated by liberation theology. I was just reading Shannon Kern's book. What's it called? In the Margins? I can't remember.
It's okay.
And about him being a transgender man, and now he's a priest. And I find those stories really interesting, and I like studying religion and spirituality, and in a way that's not authoritarian or has this hierarchy that I think comes from white supremacy. And so that to me is still important. And a lot of the people I interact with are in churches or coming out of churches. And so I want to be some people call me a soft landing place when you're doing that, because like I'm not anti-religion. I'm not going to try to convert anyone to whatever I believe. I just want people to feel supported and safe and not have to go through abuse. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of abuse has happened, is in churches. And so that's kind of where I'm talking a lot.
Gosh, yeah, it's so true. I mean, like I try to encourage people, friends of mine that aren't going to church, that if they are looking for a church, to come to the church that I attend, just because I like hanging out with them. And Josh's church, River City Underground, it's not organized religion. It's chaos religion, basically. I mean, we meet in homes. We don't have a building. We meet in people's homes. It's very like, Book of Acts, sort of like, jumping from place to place kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons it's very chaotic. But it's good. Like, we've got a good family system and support, and it's not a mega church or anything like that. But yeah, so okay. I guess when you were writing the book, were there moments where you were kind of doubting like yourself about the way maybe you recalled a particular event, or maybe like you were writing and you're like, maybe I shouldn't publish this. Like kind of walk me through sort of like your psychological well-being as you're writing this.
Yeah, I mean, that fluctuated. Writing through traumatic memory is difficult because you're reliving things that are very painful. And when I started writing the book, I hadn't been to therapy. So once I started going to therapy and getting trauma-specific therapy like EMDR, that's when I felt like I could actually handle finishing the book, because I was in a better mental place. So that was really important to me, to be healthy in order to put this book out publicly. But yeah, I never doubted what happened, except for the fact that I was being gaslit so much that I needed like to get evidence to show that I'm not crazy. So part of the process of writing the book was like researching, like the courtship guide and getting the Patriarch magazine that we had and listening to my old pastor's sermons. And so I had all the receipts, and that was really validating. Like, I'm not crazy. This is what they said. This is how it impacted me. But that's not an easy task to do. And there was a time when I overdid it and I spent a whole week just writing the worst scenes in the book, like the hardest scenes for me. And that was a mistake because I didn't take care of myself. So if anyone's writing about trauma, be careful, like take care of yourself. That's number one important. And because it took so long to write, I thought through every little thing of what I wanted to share publicly. So when I was writing the rough drafts, I was just writing what I needed to get out. And then I would go through and think about, what am I okay with sharing? What do I want to keep back? And not that I'm lying, but that, you don't have to reveal people's privacy or specific details. So I spent a lot of time thinking through that until I felt in my intuition, like this is what I want to put out. And so I don't have any doubts now about what I have written.
That's really amazing. So my last question is kind of looking forward, and then also kind of a message to other people that might be going through what you're going through, because we recently talked to this national security counterterrorism expert, Elizabeth Newman.
Okay.
She wrote a book called Kingdom of Rage, which is really about like, she's a believer. She worked in the Trump administration. And she just kind of talked about kind of her journey of faith, and then like how she was applying sort of her counterterrorism background to Christian nationalism. And, it just sort of broke her heart. She's just like, it just sucks that, this faith that I belong to is just, being perverted in this really bad way. And, she wanted to write the book just so people, one, could learn more about Christian nationalism, but also for people to not feel alone, and I told her, I was like, you are not alone. Like, there are tons of people out there like you. You don't have to write a book, to connect with people.
Yeah.
And so being that you did write a book about sort of your own trauma, like what advice would you give to somebody, that's listening to this thinking like, wow, like Cait's story is my story, like what would you tell them?
I would say, if anything, I hope that my story validates their experience, to know that their story does matter. Even if no one ever hears it, it matters. It's important. And maybe healing might include writing down your story or sharing it with someone who's a safe, trusted person. Sometimes writing down things that have happened to you, or your anger, or whatever emotions are coming up, writing it all out and then burning that piece of paper can be really cathartic. And you're taking back the power of your life, right? Because so many people, well, not so many people, but maybe people have taken away your agency. So taking that back can take a lot of forms, and maybe writing it down is one of those. But what's important is that you know that your voice does matter. You don't have to obey someone or submit to someone who is causing you harm or taking away your personality or your sense of self. That's not healthy for you. And what's important is that you're safe. And so whatever that takes to get to a safe place, I hope that people can find that.
Yeah. So well said, and I wanted to point out too, that your book was the first book that had like the resources section in the very front. Mm-hmm. So like you have like the National Domestic Violence Hotline, Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, Coalition for Responsible Home Education. I mean, like, I just thought it's so much. I read so many books, and like, this was the first time I saw them. Like, wow, I need to probably buckle up, Like if you're putting sort of like the numbers to call, like it's gonna be serious, and it was. So good on you for doing that. So
yeah, well, I mean, I did that because my primary audience, as I was writing, was people like me, and so when you're figuring out the language for your experience, sometimes you're like, I need support, right? And so I just wanted people to know that there is support if they need it right away. And that's why I put that in the front, just so that it's easy to find.
No, great. Perfect. So how can people get your book, stay, aware of what it is you're doing, or get in contact with you?
Yeah. So my book is available now anywhere that you like to get your books. So Barnes & Noble, Amazon, bookshop.org. You can ask for it at your library or your indie bookstore. You can find my information at caitwest.com. That's CAITWEST.com. And I'm on social media at Cait West Writes. I also have a Substack called My Blue Peninsula, where I send out newsletters, and I'm trying to do more writing there. And getting a little bit more away from social media just because it's stressful. So I find long form writing better for my mental health. So you can find me in all the places.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Cait, for writing the book, sharing your story, and just kind of being vulnerable and open to us. I think it's super, super important. And I just wish nothing but the best for you moving forward.
Thank you. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to share.
Yeah, absolutely. And to our Faithful Politics listeners and viewers, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week. Take care. I'll see you.